First of all, let me say thank you to Father Antonio and to the Institute for hosting this event. And I'd like to say a very general word of thanks to Professor Sloan and to Ken Myers. I have more specific words of thanks, but I think I'll save them until after I hear what they have to say. But that's forthcoming, hopefully. I want to say a bit about what this book is about by saying a bit about how it came about. As Father Antonio mentioned, it's been a long time in the making and went through many permutations as my life and intellectual companions changed over the years. The idea first came to me as a graduate student at Cambridge. I'd come to Cambridge after reading John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory as a master's student at Duke. Most of our students here probably have not even heard of the book, much less read it. And if you do know it, you know that it shows a bit of age now. But its impact on my world when it appeared in the 1990s was like a bomb going off. Reading that book changed my life. Duke at the time was dominated by Barthian Christocentrism and Yale School post-liberalism. And though I had begun to be attracted to Aquinas and some modern Catholic thinkers, this was really all that I knew. Metaphysics was deeply suspect, and creation was somewhat of a neglected theological category, though I had come away with the conviction that a world created by God was in some sense a fundamentally different place from a world that simply happened by accident, and that creation must therefore make some difference to the world. I just really didn't know how to think about that. So my experience of reading theology and social theory was like the experience of Faulkner's Mississippi Gentleman who lays eyes on New Orleans for the first time. It was foreign and exotic and maybe a little bit dangerous. Milbank had argued that the secular was not a metaphysically neutral space that just naturally emerged when religion had lost its steam, but was rather a construct that had to be positively imagined on metaphysical and theological grounds. And he showed that just as there's no neutral space outside of creation, there was ultimately no neutral cognitive space outside of metaphysics and theology. This meant that theology could recover its confidence and return from an exile in which it had acquiesced and lay claim to realities from which it had been banished, that it had something to say about everything. For me and other young theologians from similar backgrounds, this was really exhilarating stuff. It opened up exciting new worlds that I had never imagined and made possible thoughts that I didn't know it was possible to think. So inspired by Milbank, a group of us young Turks descended on Cambridge at about the same time, intoxicated with the elixir of what would become radical orthodoxy, and determined to write the next Theology and Social Theory. And one night during my first term, we were at a dinner party at Milbank's, and Richard Dawkins was at the height of his prowess in Britain at the time, and the subject quickly turned to Darwin and evolution. This led to an impassioned and pretty uneducated debate. It was obvious to me that Darwinism served as a kind of ersatz religion for secular culture, with a secularized form of providence, a kind of transcendental logic or mechanism for the outworking of history. So I knew that there had to be a metaphysics buried in there someplace. It also struck me as kind of an inviting target, the last great 19th century ideology not to have been discredited. And so I decided there on the spot, with my first term at Cambridge when I couldn't make sense of anything else, that I wanted to write the Theology and Social Theory of evolutionary biology, though that was and is a pretentious comparison. And though my understanding of the project changed significantly over the years as I began to think about it. The problem was that I didn't really know anything about Darwin or evolutionary biology. And I didn't have a clear sense of what was really at stake, though I knew that I wasn't satisfied with the standard ways of formulating the creation versus evolution debate. So I started working on this even before I completed my dissertation on Augustine and Descartes, and I quickly acquired a certain respect and even admiration for Darwin's genius, and I saw the need to distinguish between Darwin and some of the later Darwinians. But I also saw the sort of problem that I had expected. Darwinism was laden from the very first with metaphysical and theological judgments, both on principle and for historical reasons. And moreover, the doctrine of creation, at least as it's publicly thought about, had become entangled in these judgments. These judgments determined the meaning of creation and the question the doctrine of creation was expected to answer, and it shifted the whole public debate onto Darwinism's home field, so to speak. But I also saw that the issue was bigger than Darwinism, that Darwin was the heir to the founding metaphysical judgments of modern science, and what was in his time the prevailing Newtonian physics. And so to treat the problem in a foundational way and to extricate the doctrine of creation from these judgments, I would have to take a deeper look at the metaphysical foundations of modern science as such, and how metaphysical and theological judgments were built into its basic conceptions of matter, motion, causality, truth, explanation, and so forth. So I wanted to change the question or the terms of the debate. And as I thought more about and studied creation on the theology side, I was convinced that a proper understanding of creation, in fact, demanded this, and that the doctrine of creation couldn't be made intelligible again, much less relevant, unless it was disentangled from these ontological and epistemological assumptions of Darwin and of science more generally. It had to be rethought, in other words, in light of this entanglement. So that's what I set out to do. Now, I assume most of you have not, normal people can't afford to read the book. So I assume most of you haven't. I don't want to take too much time, but maybe a brief summary would help the discussion. There's not so much one thesis to the book as a kind of collection of interrelated theses. The first of them is indicated by the title of the book, which is a double entendre with both a positive and negative sense. The negative sense of the thesis or of the title is that a pure or neutral or merely methodological science is a fiction. Science cannot do and never has done without its metaphysics and theology, even if this is implicit or even if it is cast in the negative form of atheism. This is true both in principle and historically. Science is permeated by implicit and even metaphysical and even theological judgments that are not merely presupposed and bracketed out, but are operative in its self-understanding, in its mode of reasoning, and its a priori regard for its objects. These assumptions are built into our concept of nature and determine what God would have to be if a given understanding of nature were true, and they therefore shape the subsequent dialogue or debate. Couple this with a proper understanding of creation, and it changes how we ought to think about the relation between science and theology generally, and the doctrines of creation and evolution particularly. I think it's helpful to think of this in terms of the Christological principle, distinguish in order to unify. Since God and the world are not two items within the same order of being, creation and natural processes are not rival agencies within the same order of causation. And if the act of creation and natural processes are not mutually exclusive forms of agency, then the doctrine of creation and theories of natural science cannot be mutually exclusive forms of explanation. The standard question, creation or evolution, is thus already the expression of a bad theology, as are certain formulations of creation and evolution. And they miss what I argue is ultimately at stake in this debate, not how the world came to be, but rather what it is. So I'm largely indifferent to evolution as a biological theory now. I was never really against it or didn't believe it. I just didn't know quite how to think about it. So I'm largely indifferent to evolution as a biological theory, and in a certain sense, I want to accentuate the distinction between science, metaphysics, and theology, to keep them from being commingled and confused, to draw on another Christological term, either positively or negatively. So I say, for example, in the book, that a metaphysical and theological critique of science must remain metaphysical and theological, a critique of the metaphysics and theology which science presupposes and inevitably becomes when left to its own devices. And yet, because the act of creation is the immediate and most interior gift of being, the doctrine of creation bears more immediately and interiorly on the sciences and in their basic ontological and theological judgments than in the way we normally think about these things. That's the negative aspect of the thesis. The positive aspect is that an adequate theology of creation is indispensable to an adequate cosmology and an account of the world that is simultaneously comprehensive and non-reductive, big enough, if you will, to include us. though criteria of adequacy have to be renegotiated since science refashions, inasmuch as science refashions the meaning of truth. Because the second part of that thesis is that because the world is creation, what theology affirms of the world by creation is actually operative within scientific cognition, in fact, in spite of the way we tend to understand that. And therefore, and finally, that creation performs a service for the sciences, what I call saving the appearances, which they cannot perform for themselves, by making intelligible an essential dimension of their objects and bringing science to a greater self-understanding of its own nature. In this, I argue, the doctrine of creation is rationally superior to Darwinian evolution, not because one is simply true and the other is false, or because they are strict rivals, they're not, but because the doctrine of creation affords the more comprehensive view of reality from which scientific theorizing actually begins, and without which it inevitably falsifies itself and does violence to its objects. To paraphrase Balthasar, he who sees the most wins. So that's, in general, sort of the methodological and the principles animating the book. The book unfolds this, then, through a historical or genealogical look at the origins of modern science and the outworking of its basic ontological premises in evolutionary biology. There are a number of things I try to show on this count. First, that the cosmos is an irreducibly metaphysical and theological idea, and that the unity of the cosmos is an irreducibly metaphysical unity, a unity of being. Second, that the Platonic and Aristotelian aspiration to a comprehensive cosmology was imperfectly realized by the Greeks and brought to term in the Christian doctrine of creation and the subtle modifications that this exerts on the doctrine of being. Third, that the advent of modern science is metaphysically premised upon the reduction of being from act to brute facticity, which is of a piece with a new conception of matter as sheer abstract externality, and which allows the sciences to ascend over metaphysics to the position of first philosophy. With this reduction, the unity, immanence, interiority, and finality conferred on things by form and esse begin to disappear. Entities are reconceived as organized aggregations of parts. An active and functionalist conception of truth and knowledge places a contemplative and ontological conception, and the sciences turn their attention from things, properly so called, to the laws or the dynamics governing the interactions between things. This metaphysics and this view of nature has as its theological counterpart a reduced, extrinsic, voluntaristic, and essentially Unitarian God. And creation, as we come to think of it, is reduced to a kind of manufacture, because the giving of being no longer is significant when being itself is no longer a question. These are the basic metaphysical and theological premises of the functionalist tradition of British biology from which Darwinism springs, though I don't allege that Darwin was fully or even very much aware of them. And it matters very little that Darwin seems to disbelieve in this God or that he conceives of natural selection as a replacement for the designing hand. Insofar as he reacts against these metaphysical and theological assumptions, or insofar as he reacts against this theology, he makes it endemic to the subsequent Darwinian tradition. The disappearance of immanence, unity, and interiority in the new metaphysics is mirrored in the phylogenetic turn of evolutionary biology, I argue, and the organism begins to disappear in a twofold sense. First, as a per se unum who is a substance and the subject of its own being, and second, as the subject matter of evolutionary biology, which is now the evolutionary process itself. Though this is counterbalanced somewhat by a resurgent morphological and developmental tradition that has some salutary indications. I think it's promising, but which lacks, in my judgment, the metaphysical principles necessary to overcome its endemic reductionism. This is where a proper understanding of creation comes back in. The doctrine of creation, I want to argue, restores the organism to biology by restoring the metaphysical principles necessary to restore the organism to its own being and to account for the unity, interiority, and finality that characterize its lived life, its lived existence. Esse as non-subsistent perfection common to all things and proper to each simultaneously binds the universe into a unity of being in act, while underscoring the abiding difference of each thing, which is phenomenologically visible in the novelty and intelligibility of each concrete act of being. That's what I mean by saving the appearances. This warrants, I suggest, a new non-reductive sense of adequation, which is adequation to the whole which includes the sense we make of it. I want to suggest that this reverses mechanism in establishing the priority of the whole of being to the parts of it, restoring the priority of synthesis to analysis, the priority of the actual over the counterfactual. But it also saves the gains of mechanical analysis by conceiving it as a form of legitimate abstraction from the unity of esse commune. And so a proper metaphysics of creation, far from being anti-science, ultimately saves the sciences by saving the sciences from their own metaphysics and theology, and saving the world from the intrinsic reductionism of its metaphysics. Thank you.